During this video, I would like to take you through a tour of an esri story map. And this one is produced by NatureServe and it's on biodiversity. So we're going to look at the Map of Biodiversity Importance and Overview, mapping the places that matter most. So esri story maps are very powerful tools and they combine media and text and videos and interactive maps to help you explore a topic. And so I'm just going to go ahead and scroll down and again mention that this is a story map that was produced by NatureServe. This is a non-advocacy organization that operates in the United States, and they integrate data from comprehensive databases on more than 90,000 plants, animals, and ecosystems. And they are stewards of the environment. They curate, analyze, and communicate biodiversity data to a broad suite of partners and stakeholders. They're a great resource for governments, conservation organizations, corporations, landowners, and the scientific community, as well as the general public, and they help them to make informed decisions about sustaining the diversity of life upon which we all depend. So I'm hoping that this tour of this story map is a good blend for you of some of the ideas that we've addressed in lecture and some of the skills that you're building in your exercises. Just some nice images of some of the diverse and complex organisms that live on our Earth. And so NatureServe has recently, in 2021, unveiled the Map of the Biodiversity Importance. And this is an innovative tool for identifying critical areas for species conservation. And we're not going to explore it in this video, but I will point to you here. There is an external website that you can explore that has the full collection. So these were built on habitat suitability models for 2,216 of the nation's most imperiled species, and they combined range size and degree of protection and incorporated it into a model. And the Map of Biodiversity covers the lower 48 states, and it's a series of maps, 15 in all, that can help drive conservation efforts and help make informed decisions. So the brightest areas that you see on the map indicate where multiple imperiled species occur, and they are not already safeguarded by our current protection. I'm going to go ahead and scroll the map over, and as I do, I've just grabbed onto the map. You can see the base map below. You can see parts of California before the map repopulates, and I'm just going to scroll over here and take a look at most of the extent of California again. So these bright areas are weighted more heavily than other areas, and that means that these are areas of more concern. And then the darker areas would be of less concern. So this really helps managers decide where should we focus our efforts, where should we be looking at first. And it's nice to think of idealistic ways to conserve land, but realistically, we need to make hard decisions, and we need to focus our efforts. And by creating models like this, we can see where our efforts are best served. So with unprecedented resolution, we can now identify the places that matter most for sustaining our nation's biodiversity. Areas that are important for preventing extinction do occur across our nation, extending from rivers of the southeast to the intermountainous regions of the west and the coast of California. So in the southeast, there is a global biodiversity hotspot that is experiencing intense pressure. State and federal agencies in the Southeast are trying to balance the region's unique and threatened biodiversity with many other competing demands on natural resources, including forest production, agriculture, housing, energy, and transportation infrastructure, as well as human recreation. So, by understanding the species habitats, we can support make lawmakers and managers in making decisions across jurisdictions. We can also look at this location in Utah, and this is a surprisingly high biodiversity importance according to this model. And it's largely managed by public trust of federal agencies such as the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, but only a small portion of federal lands in Utah are comprised as areas that are protected or managed for conserving our natural and cultural heritage. And this portion of lands is unfortunately shrinking. So if we zoom in, we can see here the boundaries of some study areas and the relative amounts of concern in the brightness that is being shown in those colors. And so the areas with the brighter colors are areas at greater peril. And these are just some representative species from that area, a Cronquist's phacelia and a desert tortoise would be found in these areas. So before the map of diversity importance was developed, the best models that we had for looking at importance of conservation efforts in the United States looked like this. These are based on the ESRI technique of hotspot analysis, and it really took into account sporadic and widespread data sets. And it said, based on these data sets, we think that the areas in red are the most important to conserve. And so this was a decade ago, and it was the best that we had. And over the years, Nature Map has worked to sophisticate the model and create higher levels of detail. And so this map shows at-risk species hotspots in the locations we've been able to survey. It didn't really interpolate or map out to areas that we hadn't done detailed surveys in. And so a lot of what you're seeing in the map is not necessarily that these areas away from the red hotspot identified areas aren't in danger. It means that there's a lack of data and a lack of information. And so that was the old model, and it was a static model, just a static map, one layer, so you couldn't really interact with it. And again, it was a really great starting point, but now we have conservation maps that are much more intelligent, and they can help us make better, more streamlined decisions. So what does 2020 mean in terms of this kind of map, the year 2020? So these data are dynamic. The technology supports real-time analysis and sharing. The methods are transparent and they're repeatable. You can leverage data and technology to support smarter decisions and sustain the diversity of life upon which human beings depend. So if I zoom in a little bit more on the map, you can see that this is much more sophisticated than those areas where we had, looking at California, we did have some red areas that were hotspots, and that had a lot to do with the fact that not only are these areas important to conserve and they're in peril, but that's where we had a lot of intense data collection. And so the older interpolation maps, older compared to 2020 capabilities, really didn't tease out the difference between lack of data and a lack of risk. And so this is a huge leap forward in the right direction in terms of conservation. So I'm going to scroll back out. I will provide these links for you, and I encourage you to explore them in depth on your own and look up areas that might be of interest to you. And so if we want to go for a moment and look at the two maps together, we can click and go out to an ArcGIS application, and we have the capability here of looking at, we can turn the NatureServe data off, and we can see a map of the United States, and then we can add our NatureServe data back in, and by using our swipe tool, now we have the two different maps that I just showed you side by side. So I'm going to scroll all the way over here to the left. There is our base map of the United States, and we can certainly see most or all of Mexico and Canada. And this is a true color representation of America. And interesting to note here that the eastern seaboard is very green, a lot of forests, a lot of vegetation. We have relatively dry area here in the middle of the country. The Rocky Mountains are noticeable by that pattern that tells us that it is indeed has a high rugosity or a mountainous-like characteristic. We can see what is called the bread bowl of California here. This is where there's a lot of agricultural fields, tends to be long, flat expanses of land. And we also have mountainous regions here in the eastern part of California and in the northwest of California. The famous Pacific Northwest Forest extends about from the beginning in California all the way up and through into Canada. It's very obvious to see that it's a very green, lush area. And then we also can see the desert regions that are very characteristic of Arizona, Nevada, and parts of Utah. Salt Lake City is jumping out to me as well, and you can see various water bodies. Now, if I use the slider, I can then come across with my data set, and now I'm looking at those colors which we know are identifying the areas of biodiversity that are most crucial and most important. Let's go ahead and we'll zoom in. I'm going to try to get close to an area in Texas called Odessa, and some of you might find that particularly interesting. All right, so let me go one more time. Okay. So I'm going to scroll back out here. So some of this definitely should look familiar to some of you. Here we have the border of Texas, and we have New Mexico that's showing up in the corner over there. Most people know Roswell, New Mexico, especially science fiction fans. Okay, so again, if we look here, we can definitely see this model is identifying some pretty specific areas in terms of their need for conservation. And so if you look at this pattern, what do you think that this might represent? I hope that you're saying it looks like a river, and it is indeed a riverine system. And so it's not a layer of a river, but these are the polygons that are located along a water body. Water bodies have very distinct patterns called dendritic patterns, and it's easy for us to see here that this riverine system pretty extensively through what is probably most of the system is identified as being higher priority than the areas that are further away from that riverine system. All right, and then you can explore this on your own. I know whenever I'm watching somebody do this in a demo, I have so many ideas pop into my head of where I want to look, and I encourage you to do that. Let me go ahead and zoom back out, and then let's just move to another area. I'll show you one more area of the United States, and so I'm going to zoom in here to the Florida region that has a lot of swamp. And if we use our swipe tool, there we have a representation in black and white of Florida. And now when we put that layer, we make that layer visible, I should say, by moving our swipe tool across the area. You can see the different regions that have different priorities for conservation. And as I was thinking, it is no surprise to me that this area down here, which is commonly referred to as the Florida Keys, is brighter and therefore at a greater level of need of protection. And this is one of the areas of the world where we are rapidly losing our coral reefs, and the shallow benthic nature of many of these areas and the swamplands make them very vulnerable to climate change. Okay, and so scrolling all the way back out, I'll do one more pass on this data set so that you can see what is going on, big picture with the US, and different areas that are being highlighted as high priorities. So very sophisticated model. It is a very exciting time in GIS that this has just been released. In fact, it was released just a couple weeks ago, and I knew colleagues that were working on this for several years, and so I've heard about it, and I am excited to share this with you now. We can also look at that data that we had for 2008. So by comparison, we had looked at this particular area of Texas. Let's just go ahead and we will zoom in, and we'll look at that area of Texas, which is near Odessa. And you can see that the patterns of that riverine system are not showing up, and we have a lot of area that looks to be no data. That light blue color is indicative of no data. And we can also look at other areas if we want to, and we can set a transparency. I'm going to go ahead and set this transparency here, and then I'm going to turn on our other data layer, and let's see if I can move this up, and I cannot. And so let me do it this way. Let me set the transparency for the other layer. Okay. So now, if I set my transparency for our 2020 model, you can see that the other data set, and I want to go ahead and put that back to its original. So now we have a pretty good tool if we want to visually compare these two different models. Again, looking at this riverine system that we had identified here, this is from the 2020 model that we see these yellow polygons that look like a river. In the earlier models, some of these areas did come through as hotspot areas of high importance, but you can see we have a much greater level of sophistication in our newer model. And if we were to query using GIS tools, we could get much more sophisticated analysis on specific areas, on specific species, and specific parts of these ecosystems. One other thing that I wanted to point out for you on these data layers is that there is a legend. If you click on the down arrow next to the name of the layer, and it's showing you the legend. And so I was making an assumption about that blue polygon layer. It in fact is registering as low priority. And so these areas that you see here would be no data, where the map below is actually showing through. Okay, and then the areas of blue would be low priority according to the 2008 model. And then again, our areas of red are our what are classified as the hot spots and the areas in most need. So both models are valid. Again, this newer model that is being brought out by NatureServe is definitely something that a lot of folks are very excited about. So we'll give one last pass to it before we move on, and appreciate again what this might mean for conservation workers. Okay. So where do these high resolution maps come from? There are an army of sensors that are being managed by NatureServe's network of botanists and zoologists. There's over 1,000 that are collecting data. And the information infrastructure brings the data together, and the best of data science turns that information into knowledge. And this allows us to say with certainty that the southeastern coastal plain or the mountains of Utah are keys to sustaining biodiversity. So another complex factor of this model is not only what areas are at risk and need the most conservation, but what areas are going to give us the most benefit. And it's an analysis that allows us to maximize limited resources. So we only have so much money that we can devote to conservation efforts. And these types of models let us know if we apply our conservation efforts in these areas, we're going to have the greatest probability of success in terms of not rescuing, but of promoting biodiversity or increasing the conservation issue in the area, increasing it in a positive way. Increasing the solution is probably a better way to say that. So it's using habitat suitability modeling as well, and these detailed maps of likely habitat are based on the most at-risk species. Where are they found? Where do they prefer to be found? And it aggregates that to produce a map of biodiversity map collection. Okay. And the recipe for better biodiversity mapping. This is another story map that we will explore, and I'm going to provide that resource for you as well, and you can read more about the specifics of how they make that map that we just looked at. Little bit of a diversion there. Let's get back onto the main road. And so public lands matter, but not necessarily the places that you might think. And so this reveals that federal lands designated for multiple uses, including resource extraction, which is not limited to, but includes logging, mining, and fossil fuels, also provide habitat for many at-risk species. Of almost 300 imperiled species whose distributions occur almost entirely on federal lands, about half of them are found primarily on lands subject to extractive uses. We can see here McGuire's primrose. It is known from only 2 populations in the United States, and they occur on U.S. Forest Service land. The current distribution is limited to moss-covered dolomite cliff walls in Utah's Logan Canyon. The conservation status of this flowering plant is critically imperiled according to the ESA listing status. I'm sorry, according to NatureServe global conservation status, they call it critically imperiled, and the ESA, which is the Environmental Service Administration, lists it as threatened. So private lands are just as important. So while lands are and waters are managed for biodiversity conversion, please excuse me, while lands and waters managed for biodiversity conservation provide direct benefits to imperiled species by limiting activities that might threaten them, only 10% of the lower 48 states are designated for this level of species protection. and that refers to the public land availability. But private lands cover a much larger area and are just as important for conserving biodiversity. This is a California red-legged frog, and the NatureServe Global Conservation work has classified it as imperiled, and the ESA listing says that it is threatened. So there are opportunities to prevent extinctions all around you. No matter where you live in the world, the chances are there's a place near you that's critical to sustaining the diversity of life on this planet. And approximately 90% of the US population lives within 30 miles of an area of high biodiversity importance. And this gives concerned citizens an opportunity to contribute to conservation locally. The Map of Biodiversity Importance is only the first of a view of what's called a living map, and it's one that will evolve into an intelligent nervous system for conservation. So one of the great powers of leveraging this technology that you're learning about is that not only are we able to create models that predict what might happen in the future, we're able to create map products which will show what kinds of things we need to consider in making our decisions and where should we start. One of the most common things that I hear students say when we talk about sustainability is it can be overwhelming. Where do I start? And these kinds of models can give us that information and help us to do what they call mapping where it matters most. This resource will be available to you, and I encourage you to explore it. Thank